They said he was born under a cursed moon, pale as bone, eyes red like spilled wine. In the slave markets of Louisiana, even the cruelest traders stepped back when he was brought out. "That boy ain't right," one whispered. But one woman didn't look away. She smiled. New Orleans, 1842. The slave auction yard reeked of sweat, iron, and despair. Among the rows of chained men and weeping women stood a boy, no more than 12, his skin so white it seemed to shimmer under the morning sun. He wasn't sick, they said. He was unnatural. Plantation owners passed him by. They wanted strength, not superstition. Rumors said he brought misfortune, that his mother died screaming, and his birth had turned the river red for a night. Some called him Ghost Child. Others said he was cursed by African spirits who marked him to remind men of their cruelty. He was left in the corner of the pen, naked but for a rag, his eyes watching every buyer with the blank calm of someone who already understood pain. The traders tried to beat obedience into him, but the boy didn't cry. He only looked at them, and some swore the air went cold when he did. When night fell, they locked him in a wooden crate. He sang softly in an old dialect no one recognized. The overseer claimed he dreamt of that voice for days after, a song about fire and bone. By the fourth auction, even the other slaves avoided him. But one morning, as thunder rolled in from the Gulf, a new buyer arrived. A carriage door opened, and out stepped a woman in silks so heavy they strained her breath. She was large, immense, with pale skin powdered white and lips painted blood red. Her name was Madame Estelle Duverot, widow of a sugar baron, and her appetite for strange things was whispered all across the parish. She asked for the pale one. The trader warned her, "He ain't like the rest." Estelle only smiled, her voice honey-thick. "Neither am I." When the chain was lifted from his wrists, the boy looked up for the first time. Those red eyes met hers, and the wind seemed to die. That night, her servants saw the carriage leave the market, carrying the albino boy into the mist toward her estate, La Maison du Sable. But the driver swore, just before the gates closed, that the boy turned and whispered something to him in perfect French. "You will never see me again." Would you have dared to buy him, or run? Madame Estelle Duverot was known from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, not for her beauty, but for her presence. She was immense in both body and reputation. The townsfolk whispered she had outlived 3 husbands, each dying more mysteriously than the last. Her mansion, La Maison du Sable, stood on the edge of a sugar field drowned in swamp mist, its iron gates etched with lilies that had long since rusted red. When the albino boy arrived, Estelle insisted he be placed not with the other servants, but in the east wing, near her private quarters. The maids objected. The room was once her late husband's study, sealed since his death. But Estelle had the key, and her word, like her body, carried weight. The boy, silent, watchful, did not resist. He walked through the corridor like one who had already memorized the place. Some said he traced his fingers along the walls as if he recognized the carvings. The servants avoided him, crossing themselves when they passed his door. By dawn, one maid quit without collecting her pay. Estelle began calling him Lucien. She claimed he reminded her of an angel from a dream, pale, perfect, unspoiled by the sun. Yet those who saw her watch him knew her interest was not motherly. There was hunger in her gaze, a hunger that frightened even her cook, who had seen plenty of madness before. She ordered fine silk clothes for him, white as milk, and had him dine at her table. But he barely touched his food. When she asked what he liked to eat, Lucien's answer chilled the room. "What you bury, madame?" That night, thunder rolled again over the bayou, and the hounds outside howled without reason. Servants said they heard Estelle's laughter echo through the hall, followed by a sound they could not name. The next morning, the cook found the master's portrait turned upside down. The floor beneath it was damp, as if something had seeped up from below. By the week's end, Estelle dismissed her staff entirely. She claimed she needed quiet for the boy. Neighbors who passed the gates noticed the curtains drawn tight, even on the hottest afternoons. And one traveler swore, while riding past the mansion at dusk, that he saw the obese lady dancing slowly in candlelight, her hands resting on the boy's shoulders, their faces turned toward the window. Both smiling, both pale as death. If you lived near that house, would you have watched? Or warned someone? By the second month, La Maison du Sable had gone silent. The fields lay untended, shutters nailed shut, and the great bell that once marked the servants' hours had not rung since Lucien arrived. The townsfolk whispered that Madame Estelle had fallen ill again, but those who lived closest said otherwise. They said the house breathed at night. Every evening, a faint humming drifted across the cane fields. It wasn't music, it was lower, almost a vibration, like a chant swallowed by the earth. And sometimes, between the notes came voices, familiar voices, the dead ones. Inside, Madame Estelle had grown pale and feverish, yet strangely euphoric. She spoke of conversations beyond the veil, of her late husband visiting her dreams to whisper secrets of sugar and gold. She spent hours locked in the east wing with Lucien, the sound of her laughter twisting through the hall. The housekeeper, one of the few who remained, dared to look through the keyhole one night. She saw the obese lady sitting in a velvet chair, her hands trembling as Lucien stood before her, eyes closed. The boy's voice was not his own, deep, ancient, echoing. And then she heard a man's tone reply. From nowhere, from within the walls. When Estelle noticed her spying, she didn't shout. She only opened the door slowly, smiled, and whispered, "He knows your brother's name." The housekeeper fled that very night, never to return. Days turned to weeks. Lucien began to wander the corridors barefoot, tracing symbols into the dust. Circles, eyes, stars that seemed to move when the light shifted. When asked what he was drawing, he said softly, "Maps of where the voices sleep." Meanwhile, Estelle grew thinner despite her size, as if something inside her was being hollowed out. But her eyes glowed with purpose. "He's teaching me," she told a priest who came to bless the property. "The world of the living is a lie. The real one lies beneath." The priest refused to enter. As he turned away, he swore he heard a second heartbeat coming from the house. Slower, heavier, like something vast breathing beneath the floors. That same night, thunder returned, shaking the windows. Witnesses said a red glow flickered behind the curtains, followed by screams that weren't quite human. By dawn, the priest's carriage stood abandoned on the road, doors open, rosary still swinging from the seat. And on the mansion's front step, pressed into the wet earth, were two barefoot prints, one large, one small, both pointing inward. Would you have crossed that threshold, knowing what waited inside? Summer came heavy and swollen over the Louisiana marshes. The air around La Maison du Sable hung thick with rot and sweetness, sugarcane decaying in the fields, mingling with the scent of something far older. The townsfolk whispered that Madame Estelle was seen again at her balcony, though she no longer resembled the woman they remembered. Her body, once soft and immense, now appeared rigid and pale as wax, but her smile, that remained. She began speaking to the wind, calling out a name that hadn't been heard in over a decade. Jean Douvreau, her late husband, the sugar baron. He had died, they said, choking on his own blood after a fever. But Estelle now swore he was near. She told her driver, trembling at the foot of the stairs, that she heard Jean pacing at night, his cane tapping the floorboards, his scent thick with tobacco and molasses. Lucien, the albino boy, had changed too. He no longer spoke often, but when he did, the words came layered, his voice and another, deeper one beneath it. Servants who lingered long enough claimed they saw two shadows where only one should fall. The mirrors in the hall had been covered, yet sometimes a reflection moved when neither of them did. One humid evening, Estelle hosted a private supper. No invitations, no guests, only two places set at her table. The servants peered through the cracks of the kitchen door and swore they saw a third figure sitting with her. A man-shaped shimmer, faint as mist, but there. His chair sank with weight no one could see. She laughed that night, louder than the storm outside. "He's come back," she sang. "My husband has returned. My Jean walks again." But by morning, the mansion was filled with the stench of spoiled meat. The servants found Estelle in her chair, still smiling, her hands clasped in prayer. Beside her lay a cane, old, polished, and reeking of grave mold. Lucien stood by the window, humming the same song he'd sung. In the slave pen, "He's not gone," he whispered. "He just needed to be fed." Down in the cellar, the ground was soft, freshly disturbed. The butler who went to investigate never came back. Only his hat surfaced 3 days later, floating in the flooded cane ditch behind the property. From that day forward, anyone passing La Maison du Sable swore they could hear the rhythmic thud of a cane striking wood, followed by the quiet hum of a boy answering it. Would you have believed her if she told you the dead could be fed? Autumn crept across the bayou, heavy with mosquitoes and decay. The cane fields surrounding La Maison du Sable grew wild, their once orderly rows twisted into tangled corridors. The slaves who worked them whispered that the soil was poisoned, that something beneath it drank more than rain. No wagons came now to the estate. No sugar left its gates. But still, the smoke from Estelle's chimneys rose every night, thick and black. Those who dared approach swore it smelled of sweet molasses laced with copper, like syrup boiling over blood. Inside, the great dining hall was transformed. The long table, once polished and grand, had been stripped bare except for a dozen silver bowls filled with sugar, honey, and red-stained water. Candles dripped endlessly, their wax pooling like flesh. In the center sat Madame Estelle, her gown straining against her swollen body, skin glistening with sweat and something darker, something wet. Lucian sat beside her, silent and still. His once shy eyes now glowed with unnatural calm. He had not aged, yet his presence had thickened, like air before a storm. When Estelle raised her goblet, he whispered words in a language no one recognized, a sound like wind through bone. That night she declared the first feast of reunion. She ordered her remaining servants, only 4 by then, to attend. Trembling, they obeyed. Before them, Estelle unveiled the main dish, a glistening roast of indeterminate origin, pink and steaming, bones too small to be from any beast of the field. "Eat!" she commanded. "Eat and remember him." The servants wept. None touched their plates. One, a young maid from Port-au-Prince, screamed when she saw a lock of hair, blonde, delicate, beneath the glaze. She ran for the door, but froze mid-step as Lucian began to hum. The melody was soft, almost kind, and her body stiffened as if seized by invisible hands. Estelle rose then, towering and trembling. "Jean is here," she cried. "He's watching us." "Feed him." She plunged her own hands into the dish and ate with the frenzy of a starving beast. When dawn came, the candles had all burned down to stubs. Only Estelle and the boy remained at the table. The servants were gone. The doors were locked from within. Days later, hunters following the river found a wild sow's carcass near the property, headless, skin peeled away in perfect sheets. And on its back, carved deep into the flesh, were the words, "Sugar for the living, blood for the dead." If you were invited to that feast, would you have eaten or prayed? By winter, the cane fields around La Maison du Sable had turned black. Frost clung to the edges of the swamp like old lace, and the air hung thick with the stink of something rotting beneath the soil. Travelers passing on the river road began to steer clear of the mansion, for even the hounds refused to walk near its gates. The only sound that came from within was the slow creak of the cellar door, opening and closing in rhythm with the wind. Inside, the grand halls had gone dim. The windows were sealed, the mirrors covered with sheets yellowed by candle soot. Madame Estelle no longer left her chambers. She was said to have grown monstrous in size, her body sagging and swelling in strange places, her breath shallow and sweet, with the smell of decay. Yet still she spoke of Lucian as if he were her salvation. It was the cook's apprentice, a girl named Amélie, who first dared to descend into the cellar after hearing the sounds. She claimed it was not weeping or moaning, but breathing, slow, labored, inhuman breathing. She carried a candle down the steps, the air growing colder with each step until the flame guttered blue. The cellar was vast and low, its stone walls slick with moisture. Sugar barrels lined the far corners, but the smell was wrong, coppery, metallic. And then she saw it. The floor had been dug open. A pit, wide and deep, filled with dark liquid that pulsed like something alive. Around it, drawn in chalk and blood, were symbols, circles within circles, strange letters she could not read. At the edge of the pit stood Lucian. His pale form shone in the candlelight, and when he turned, she saw his eyes, not red anymore, but black, reflecting nothing. "She sleeps now," he whispered. "But he's awake." Amélie fled screaming. By morning she was gone, her bed empty, her footprints ending at the back door. Only her rosary remained, crushed into the cellar threshold as though pressed there by enormous weight. After that, the house seemed to change. The walls bulged slightly as if breathing. The air grew heavy with whispers, and the rats, once countless, vanished entirely. Lucian could be seen walking barefoot in the halls, humming his grave song, the one that made the candles flicker in reply. And beneath the house, deep under the sugar barrels and the rotting beams, came a sound unmistakable to anyone who ever worked the cane fields, the rhythm of a cane tapping wood, followed by the faint groan of something vast turning in the earth. If you had heard that breathing from below, would you have opened the door or sealed it forever? The winter storms rolled in heavy from the Gulf, thick clouds pressing low against the cane fields. The townsfolk said the sky over La Maison du Sable never went fully dark. It burned with a faint reddish glow like embers hidden under ash. Then came the night they would never forget, the night the rain turned red. It began just after sundown. The river rose and thunder cracked like splitting bones. A ferryman on the bayou claimed the air near Estelle's property shimmered as if the world there had turned to liquid. When the first drops fell, they weren't clear. They streaked crimson down his arms, sticky and warm. He fled, shouting that the heavens had opened to wash the sins of the dead. Inside the mansion, the final candles still burned. Madame Estelle sat by her window, her massive frame now draped in black lace, face pale as the moon. Her eyes were wild, reflecting the rain as it streaked down the glass. "He's coming," she whispered. Jean walks again. Lucien stood behind her, his hands folded, silent as always. But this night something changed. The wind tore open the shutters, and the red rain splattered across the floorboards, staining the silk rugs like veins spreading in water. Lucien didn't move. He looked up at the storm, closed his eyes, and began to speak. Not in French, not in English, something older, a language that made the air itself vibrate. The house trembled. The portraits rattled against the walls, and from the cellar came the sound of something rising. Estelle rose from her chair, clutching her chest. Jean, I've done all you asked," she screamed. "I gave you what you wanted." But the voice that answered wasn't her husband's, it was Lucien's. And yet, it wasn't. His mouth moved, but the sound that came through was deep and layered, many voices speaking as one. "He is no more," they said. "Only what you fed remains." Estelle collapsed to her knees, sobbing, reaching for him. "Then take me too," she begged. "I gave you life." A flash of lightning split the room, and for one instant, the ferryman watching from the river swore he saw it, a massive shadow behind her, headless and tall, hands like twisted roots resting on her shoulders. The rain fell harder, and the river turned the color of rust. By morning, the bayou was silent. The mansion's windows were shattered. No fire burned within, but those who passed at dawn saw something impossible. The sugarcane had grown overnight, tall and perfect again, their stalks dripping with a sweet red sap that smelled like iron. If the rain outside your window turned to blood tonight, would you dare to look up? By early spring of 1843, La Maison du Sable had become a place of dread. Merchants crossing the river refused to speak its name. But rumors reach far, and curiosity travels faster than fear. From Baton Rouge came 3 men, a constable, a priest, and a land assessor, sent to investigate unpaid taxes and unsettling reports of unnatural occurrences. None of them expected what they found. The road to the estate was nearly gone, swallowed by mud and overgrown cane. The horses balked, trembling as the air grew colder the closer they came. The constable, a man named Briggs, joked that the swamp had more ghosts than water. No one laughed. By dusk they reached the mansion gates. The iron lilies were corroded, sagging like bent spines. The doors stood open. Inside, the house smelled of sugar, mildew, and something sour beneath it, a sickly sweet rot that clung to their throats. The main hall was a ruin, paint peeled from the walls, furniture overturned, and a dozen melted candles fused to the floor like tears. Yet there were signs of life. A half-eaten loaf of bread, a still warm cup of tea, and a soft hum coming from somewhere deep within. They followed the sound, a low, melodic murmur, to the east wing. The priest whispered a prayer under his breath. When they opened the door, their lanterns revealed a sight that froze them all. Madame Estelle sat upright in a chair, her body grotesquely swollen, her skin waxen and veined blue. Her mouth was open, but no breath came. Across her lap lay a silver tray filled with lumps of sugar-soaked red. Her hands were clasped as if in prayer, but her eyes, clouded and milky, were watching them. The constable swore and stepped back. That's when they heard it, footsteps from behind the curtains. Out stepped Lucien, barefoot, wearing a tattered white shirt, his eyes dark as ink. "You came too late," he said softly. "She's been fed." The priest tried to bless him, raising his cross, but the metal blackened in his hand. Lucien tilted his head. "She wanted eternity," he murmured. She has it now. The assessor fled, crashing through the hallway. When he reached the courtyard, the air thickened, heavy and damp. From the sugar fields, figures began to rise. Dozens of them, human shapes, gray and glistening, swaying like the cane itself. Only one man, Briggs, stumbled back to Baton Rouge before dawn, his mind shattered. He spoke of red-eyed spirits growing from the earth, whispering the same word over and over. Lucien, if you had walked through those open doors, would your courage have lasted past the first breath? Weeks after the Baton Rouge men vanished, the parish was quiet again. Too quiet. The cane fields that bordered La Maison du Sable had grown unnaturally tall. Their green turned pale and brittle, almost white. From the river road, travelers claimed to see figures moving between the stalks, small, thin shapes that disappeared when called to. A fisherman from St. James Parish swore he heard children laughing one dawn, though no plantation within 10 miles had slaves that young anymore. When he called out, the laughter stopped. Moments later, something brushed against his boat, soft like hands dragging through the water. When he looked over the edge, he saw faces staring up from the reflection. Ghostly white, eyes black as ink. At night, that laughter spread. It came from the fields, from the trees, even from beneath the porch steps of the old mansion. Locals said the voices belonged to les enfants du sable, the children of the sand, spirits of those Estelle had fed to her dead husband's hunger. Others whispered they were something worse, not ghosts, but seeds. Inside the decaying house, Lucien remained. No one saw him eat or sleep. He roamed the halls barefoot, humming his hollow song, the same one that had cursed the auction yard years before. On certain nights he walked out into the cane, and the pale stalks bent toward him as if bowing. The air shimmered faintly around his body, and faint lights, like fireflies, began to flicker in the darkness. Those lights moved. They multiplied. Within weeks, travelers claimed the entire field glowed faintly at night, pulsing like breath. And if you stood long enough, you could see them. Dozens of small bodies standing between the canes, skin white, eyes empty, their voices whispering, "Sugar for the living, blood for the dead." When a farmer from a neighboring estate tried to burn the field, his torch went out before it touched the stalks. He swore the earth beneath him moved, soft and wet, like breathing soil. He ran home barefoot, leaving his mule behind. The next morning, the mule's skeleton was found upright, buried chest deep, its skull turned toward the mansion. As spring returned, no birds sang there. The cane grew thicker, the river redder. And sometimes, when the wind blew from the south, it carried the faint giggle of children, the kind that should warm a heart, but instead turned it to ice. If you heard those children laughing from your own backyard, would you call for them, or run inside and lock the door? By midsummer of 1843, La Maison du Sable had become a wound on the parish. The pale cane fields swayed without wind, the earth beneath them swollen like a blister. No one dared cross the property line. Even the constables refused to go near it, muttering that the devil himself had purchased the land. But fear burns slower than curiosity, and curiosity can still carry a torch. On the night of July 12th, a group of townsmen gathered by the river, 6 men armed with rifles and whiskey. Their leader, old Baptiste Leclerc, had once worked the estate before Estelle's madness. He spat in the mud and said, "That house ain't right. It's better to burn what the Lord's forgotten." They crossed the flooded fields by lantern light. The mansion loomed ahead, a ruin of sagging shutters and leaning chimneys, its windows flickering faintly, like eyes half asleep. From within came the faint hum of Lucien's voice, carrying across the water, too calm, too measured. When they reached the front steps, Baptiste saw something that made his hands shake. The portraits lining the hall had changed. Where Estelle's face had once smiled from her gilded frame, there now stared a pale child with red eyes and a cruel, knowing smile. They poured kerosene across the porch and struck their matches. The flames took quickly, wood dry as paper, curtains igniting in long curls of orange. The house screamed. Not crackling, not popping, screamed. From inside came the pounding of feet, dozens of them, running toward the walls, pounding with fists too small to break free. Then the laughter started, high, sharp, and wrong. It echoed. Through the burning rooms, a choir of children's voices, the same that haunted the fields. Baptiste dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, shouting prayers, but his words were drowned out by another voice rising from the cellar, deep, thunderous, inhuman. "You cannot burn what has already been consumed," it bellowed. The roof collapsed. Smoke and embers poured into the sky, and the red rain returned, faint but real, hissing as it struck the fire. The men fled in terror, their lanterns extinguished by the storm. By dawn, nothing remained but the iron gates and a blackened foundation. No bones, no bodies, only the faint scent of sugar, sweet and charred, carried on the wind. Yet weeks later, travelers reported seeing a pale boy standing at the ruins, barefoot, watching the river. When spoken to, he would only ask one question, soft, calm, and empty. "Have you come to feed them? If your sins could not burn, would you try to drown them, or kneel before them?" Years passed. La Maison du Sable was gone, its ashes long scattered by the wind, yet the land refused to rest. No one rebuilt there. No cane grew straight in that soil. Each stalk curved unnaturally, its color pale as bone, its juice tinged faintly red. The locals called it Terre du Sang, the blooded ground. By 1851, the swamp had reclaimed most of the ruins. But travelers still spoke of strange sights, the faint glow of lanterns bobbing through the mist, the echo of footsteps where no road remained, and always the sound of a cane tapping slowly against wood. Those who lingered too long claimed the air tasted of sugar and iron, sweet and sharp all at once. A surveyor, sent by the parish, arrived one summer to map the area. His report survived, brittle pages found in a courthouse archive decades later. He described unease from the moment he crossed the old gates. "The ground feels hollow," he wrote, "soft, as though the earth remembers being dug open." At dusk, he followed a faint humming to what had once been the cellar. There was nothing there, just a shallow depression in the mud, shaped like a circle. He bent to examine it, and the soil pulsed. Once, twice, as if breathing. He fled, but before reaching his horse, he turned back. In the fading light, he saw small figures rising from the field, white as wax, heads bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. At their center stood a taller shape, still and silent. He wrote that it resembled a boy of 12, eyes black as coal, smiling like he'd been waiting a very long time. That was the last line of his report. His horse returned to Baton Rouge alone the next morning, reins torn, eyes wide with fear. By the turn of the century, sugar still wouldn't grow there, though other crops thrived nearby. Locals refused to cut the wild cane. Children dared each other to touch it, but never twice. The few who did swore they heard whispers under the soil, voices chanting in rhythm, as though reciting a prayer that had no end. And on stormy nights, when the river runs red with clay and rain, old men in taverns still tell the story of the albino boy, the one no master wanted, until the wrong woman claimed him for her own. They lower their voices then, and someone always asks the same question. If the sugar still tastes sweet, do you think it remembers? If you found yourself standing on that cursed soil, would you taste it, or pray you never had?